This legend found a secret method to make $2.5 million with copywriting without having any large following. We investigate how he scaled the business within 1 year with a simple trick.
What gets you from $50,000 a year to $1 million a year? One of the other big answers to that question is
we dissect how he managed to increase prices drastically.
I'd hear the numbers $500, $700, $1,000, $2,000. Like, I just realized there was way more room at the upper end of this price range.
We learn how you can productize a service and sell it at ridiculously high prices.
So our pilots right now are like $21,000 is kind of the lowest cost pilot we do for, it's like 12-ish pieces of content.
And we examine why cold outreach is a trap.
That's my warning to entrepreneurs about that cold outreach as being your first.
Welcome to Money and Power. This is a masterclass on how to build a massive scalable business on something as seemingly boring as copywriting.
We want to have peer-to-peer conversations. The question is how to win.
So Karl, great to have you on. You essentially started a niche copywriting business without an audience, without a big network, and you grew it to $1 million in the first full year. And I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are interested in how the hell did you achieve that? So can you tell us a little bit more about like the general outline of the business?
Sure.
What exactly were you selling and how did all of this go down?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kevin. It's always good to talk about this stuff and kind of open up the kimono, so to speak. So the backstory on Draft.dev, which is the first business I started that took off enough to talk about. I had been the first employee at a couple of startups, early stage software startups. Most recently, it was one called The Grade Network, and we were doing okay. COVID hit, and our whole model was selling to schools a product that they would primarily use in person. And so really things just kind of hit the fan. Like schools had no idea, grade schools had no idea what they were going to do in the following year when COVID, was sort of shutting them down. Everybody's going remote. And it just wasn't something they were going to make a decision to add our software into the mix. It was just too complicated to like deal with, right? So new sales shuts down. At the meantime, investors who we would have relied on for more money start to like kind of pull back and say, we're going to hold off on investing till we see where the world's going to go after this whole thing. Cause it's just a world-changing event, obviously. So the company's not in a good spot. And I started to look for something to do on the side. So I started having conversations. I sort of got exposed to this world of what we'll call developer marketing and developer relations a couple of years before, because I had started speaking at conferences. As a software engineer, I often would build stuff or learn things that I thought were cool, and I'd go pitch them as talks at conferences. So I've always liked speaking. I've always liked going out to conferences and meeting other people. So I knew there was this whole discipline of people who went to conferences to reach software developers, to sell them things, right? So I knew that existed, and I had some contacts in that industry, and I started reaching out to them and saying hey, I know, COVID's shut down all the conferences these days. Would you guys be interested in me writing some blog posts for you? And I figured, as my company is kind of winding me down and the whole company is kind of figuring out what it's going to do, maybe I'll just write some on the side as an engineer. I've got this technical skills and I like to write. So let's combine the two, right? So within a month or two, though, I had probably 50 of these conversations, just feeling people out, seeing if they'd pay me, how much would they pay, what were they looking for in their blog content and technical content that I could help with. And it was very clear that there was a huge demand in the market and just very little supply of high quality writers who were also experienced in software engineering. And as I say that, it makes sense, right? Because as a software engineer, I didn't take a single English class at college. So nobody was teaching me to write. It was just something I liked to do. And it's just so happened to be a few of us that like to do that sort of thing. So the rates that I was hearing for how much people would pay for a blog post just started to creep up as I started talking to more and more and bigger companies. And I realized, okay, there's a real business here. There's a real need, and I could probably do this. So I started to do it myself. At first, I'm doing all the roles, right? Writing all the content, doing all the calls with customers, figuring out what they're going to write about. And slowly what I started to do was take pieces of that work and slice it off and give it to freelancers. So I've always had this, even when I was a CTO and engineer at startups, I always had this habit of tracking my time and deciding which things am I doing that are my highest leverage tasks versus the things that I can outsource to someone else. So that was something that served me really well as I started the business and started to look for, who should I be hiring first? And I just followed that format of continuing to raise prices as demand came in and replace lower cost clients or lower paying clients with higher paying clients, figure out how to outsource more and more of my work. And so I could focus at least half or more of my time on just business development, sales and marketing, and building up the company. And that's honestly it sounds simple, but there was enough pent up demand in the industry that it just drove our growth. And that first full year, we did the first little half year of doing this part-time. I think we did $50,000 in revenue, and it was basically just like all to me. There was no costs really associated with it. And that next year we did $1 million, and we started to hire a team. We probably had 5 or 6 full to part-ish time people. We ended up building up a writer pool in that first full year of maybe 100 people or so, all software engineers all around the world to kind of do our work. And we started to build some automations to make it easier to manage. Anyway, so it just kind of snowballed from there. And then, so that's kind of the quick how I got started in this. I had been the first employee a couple of times at startups, like I mentioned. So I kind of knew what it looked like to start a business, but those were all funded by VCs and had more cash in the bank on day zero. So this was an interesting experience to go through bootstrapping. And there's a lot of pros and cons and differences when you do that kind of business. I don't know if you've been in both worlds, Kevin, but I'll tell you, like, it is very humbling to be in that bootstrapped world where you're like, there is $0 in the bank other than what we can make happen today. And it's fun, but it's this constraint that sort of forces you to think very differently about a company than when you have $5 million you just raised and you've got to now spend it in 2 years.
Yeah. And I mean, it's very impressive to, for you to just get started. First year, like first half year, as you said, 50,000. That is still incredibly impressive, even more so as then the first full year was 1 million already. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that. So maybe like the most basic question, what exactly were you selling? So were there some different packages? How did you sell that?
So it started off very granularly. What I was selling was blog posts. I would tell you a blog post for X dollars. And it started off like the very first spreadsheet I had, I modeled it out at making $300 to $500 per blog post. And I thought that was pretty good. If I wrote, 10 blog posts a month, I'd make a few $1,000 and that might be a nice, a bit to hold me over until I figure out my next job. Right. But as I started talking to more and more customers, again, I think early on, one of the key things a lot of people don't do that I had seen them not do and really didn't want to replicate was like, people are afraid to talk to too many customers too early, they'll say, because they're like, well, the service isn't ready. I don't really want to blow my shot with a big company. I was like, fuck that. I'm going to talk to as many people that will have these conversations, ask for as many intros as I can, even if I have nothing to sell them. It was just purely get my foot in a door with somebody and just build that. I'll build the relationship over time. So I talked to 30 to 50 of these DevRels and dev marketing people, just asking them how much would you pay for a really high quality blog post that was ready to publish, right? And just throw it out there. And they'd say, man, if I could get that. And then I'd hear the numbers, $500, $700, $1,000, $2,000. I just realized there was way more room at the upper end of this price range that I wasn't getting when I was charging $500 an article. So the key for me was raise prices quickly. And so I think by the end of that first year, it was probably $1,200 a blog post. By the end of the second year, the real first full year, it was closer to $1,500, $1,600. Now it's closer to $1,800. There's still more space. There's kind of there's premium add-ons now. There's a lot more complexity to our pricing. But back then it was just very simple. You tell us how many blog posts you need, we'll write them and invoice you for it. So that's kind of how it started. And that was the unit of work we were working on. And another thing that's important about that is I was very deliberate in not being an we can do anything for anybody type service business. I think that's the other thing that I'd seen a lot of agency owners fall into is, they get a good customer and they think, well, I'll just do everything I possibly can for that one customer, those 2 customers I have. And I didn't want to. It's so hard to scale up a business like that because it takes my smart brain every single time to go onboard those people. But whereas our service being so granular and so small, it was you give us these inputs, we'll give you an output of a blog post. And I could build a machine that could do that with just a couple of key people to slot in at certain points.
All right. And let me dig a bit deeper into how you got your first sale. So essentially you said you talked to a lot of people, but in the first half year, 50,000, and then in the first full year, 1 million. That means you must have changed something fundamentally. But what did
Sure.
it look like to get these first couple of sales in as much detail as you can reveal?
Yeah.
And what did it look like later on? And I saw one of your, I think it was a tweet where you said cold outreach is a trap. And that seems counterintuitive to many people, because that's what most people start out, right? If they want to start this like side venture or this small project where they have what you had as a goal, right? I want to do like 3K, 4, 5K per month. And that'll be a good base, right? They start like hammering out LinkedIn messages, but you seem to have a different concept there.
Yeah, for sure. So those initial conversations I had with customers and potential customers were all relationship based. In other words, it started with the group of people I knew. So again, I'd been a software engineer for over 10 years. I had hired and managed teams. I had met a ton of startup founders. I'd met investors, and I just started calling that network and asking them like, do you have intros for people in DevRel? I'd also spoken at conferences. So I got to meet people at conferences who I knew were in this space. I reached out to them. So there's just a ton of little angles I started to take to just ask for like, hey, do you happen to know someone who might be interested in this? And because my pitch was so specific, it was, I'll write blog posts for companies that want to reach software engineers. It was very easy for people to think, oh yeah, this person might actually be a good person to talk to. It wasn't like, I can't think of anybody. That was never the answer. So anyway, a very specific pitch, and then starting to talk to people I knew, and then asking for introductions. And every time I'd get off of a good call with somebody who gave me some information, like, I talked to somebody at a big company who's telling me about how much they would pay for a blog post. I was asking them as like a person who might look for a job at their company someday. I was very like, I was not telling them I'm going to sell you something. It was like, I'm just curious. I want to learn about this industry. I want to be a part of this. And they're telling me all this inside information, and then I'm asking them, well, this is awesome. Do you know anybody at, such and such company or another company? Look for their LinkedIn connections or whatever, and just ask for intros. And like, people are, again, I'm coming at this super non-threatening. I'm just like, I just want to learn. And would you be willing to pass me on to someone else who could teach me more? And that learning, asking for like questions about learning, kind of built enough trust and interest in those people that then when I did have an offer within a month or two, I start going back to them. I say, hey, I learned so much in our call. Thanks for your time. Just wanted to let you know I'm starting to write blog posts. The price is X, and I just start with whatever that was at first, $500, and then it's $700 when I get enough yeses there, and that's $1,000. Like, you just kind of scale up from there. So starting with relationships, the thing it allowed me to do was start, instead of those first clients being super skeptical and being like, who the hell is this guy? I don't, he just cold emailed me. I have no relationship with him. And his first email was an ask. It wasn't like that. It was like, my first email was just, I want to learn from you. I think you're an expert. Teach me. And people love that. Like, I think this is something people love talking about themselves. Have you ever read How to Win Friends and Influence People?
Yes, I read.
One of my like go-to books I always tell entrepreneurs, it's such a stupid, simple little book, but like, it's just gold as far as like the wisdom of psychology of people. And then one of the things he says, like, people love their own name. They love talking about themselves. Is sort of like his message there. And so if you can get anyone on the phone to talk about themselves, you've won. Like, you'll build a positive feeling with that person for forever. Even if they don't work with you directly, they refer you to somebody down the line. It's like, that's just so important. So that was my approach at the beginning. And then I think,
let me ask a couple of follow-on questions there. Or let me give a comment first. I think that's also how you go on good dates, right? You ask the girl about herself.
Right.
So you keep
if
her
the date
talking,
is me
right?
talking the whole time,
So,
that was probably a bad date. Yeah.
Exactly. So, that's like the same dynamic. And then I think this is pretty genius, because this even works if you don't have a great network in that niche, right? Because even if you approach someone cold and you just ask them, hey, I'm starting up this thing, or I'm doing some research on this niche, and you are the go-to person in this niche. Like, can you lend me 15 minutes of your time? Let's hop on a phone call or whatever, right? That's still going to have higher conversion rates than if you jump in right there with like your sales pitch, right?
Right.
Absolutely. So I think that's a pretty cool tactic.
And that's my warning to entrepreneurs about that cold outreach as being your first way of getting customers, is that you'll end up with lower trust customers who are more skeptical of your offering and more afraid of that you might rip them off. And you have to do a ton of just like grinding work, which sucks. Like, I like talking to people. I mean, that's why I come in podcasts. Like, I enjoy sharing what I've learned and learning from other people. And so if you can make your sale something you like to do, you'll do it more. And that makes you get more end results, right? So like, that's one of those like hacks in being a business owner, is like, find ways to make your time shaped around things that I really like to do. And if I do that, my energy stays high and I want to do more of it. And that means I'm going to be more successful because I'm doing more of the things I like to do and less of the things that really like suck the energy out of me. So anyway, just making sales less of a like grind and like an ask and beg for attention, and more of like I want to learn about you. It's just so powerful and it makes it so much more fun to me.
Right. And then at some point you reach this point where, you know, you need to shift a couple of things up to get to 1 million, 2.5 million revenue. Yeah. So what changes did you do there?
Yeah. I mean, like, right. That initial networking tactic, like, you don't have to turn that off, but you can't just rely on that forever, because it's very dependent on me personally, which I didn't love. I mean, I wanted the business to be reliant on the business, not reliant on Karl. So the thing I knew we needed to do was develop more channels to build, like, to get more customers in, right? So we started to experiment with things like cold outreach. We started to do more intentional content that was aimed at search keywords so that people would come to us. So we now, and probably for the last 2 years, have gotten about, I would say, a third or so of our leads from referrals, about a third from organic search. So that's people searching for things like technical content or content writing for dev tools companies, whatever. And then the other third is like a blend of cold outreach, social media, and some random things that, you know, just happen here and there. So with referrals and organic, getting those channels spun up was huge, because then you can actually start to like, I can take off the gas of the like intentional networking and grinding through those conversations all the time.
And referrals, do you like actually push your clients to refer other people, or is it just something that completely organically works for you?
Almost always organic. We are, this year, we're starting to do some programs where there's some incentives. But the truth is, because draft.dev is so specific in what it does, it's only writing content for dev tools companies. These companies all know each other very well. They're kind of in this little insular world. They get the same VC investors, the same DevRel people move between them. It's very, this is one of the powers of being in a niche in an industry instead of being a generalist who does content writing for everybody, is that your name gets passed around as an expert in this one space. And it's so much easier to grow when that's the case, and so much easier to get referrals. And people are less price sensitive when they know you're an expert in their field and not just a generalist who's going to have to learn about it. It's an incredible power that like people only get afraid of because they're afraid of saying no to customers. And that's something you have, like, again, we just don't, there's certain customers that'll come in and we say, we just don't do this. You just have to get good at that.
And then you said the second big bucket is that you come up when people search for you. So is that through blog posts? Is that through like your social media assets? Is that
primarily
something else?
Blog posts at this point, although we're doing more video this year. I think that search is an interesting space. I don't know where it's going to go. The traditional way of finding answers for things just in the last 10 years has been Google search the question essentially and go through the first few results, and you hopefully find your answer. And then, those first few results are companies trying to capture some value from you, right? So that's kind of how search engine marketing or SEO has worked. Now with tools like ChatGPT and a more chat-based interface for search, I think we're going to have a shift there. And I don't know what that's going to look like, but all I know is video is super hard to replicate with AI, and it's also more engaging and interesting, and it adds kind of a new level of value to the content that you create. So often what we do is video plus written blog posts now. But it, again, this is like, that's kind of now instead of looking back. Back then, 2 years ago, it was just all text-based content. And it was what happens. There's a few ways you can kind of like do this, but what I would do is I would be talking to clients on sales calls, obviously, and I would hear common questions over and over again. So write blog posts to answer those questions, right? And then I also do keyword research to help figure out like what, sort of target keywords make sense for this. And I'm not big into like over optimizing pieces for specific keywords and long tail keywords and all that shit. Like I just want it to be like it's got to be good content that people want to read. That's like number one. Everything else is very secondary to that. So you got to have good visuals in it. You got to have good, like interesting content with like cited sources and stuff that make me build trust. But like all the I don't know, latent semantic, like long tail keywords that people talk about, I think that's all just bullshit. I don't think it matters anymore. But that's a different rant. So I don't have to get into that.
Yeah, I think Google gets better and better at sniffing out these tactics, and
if you think your hack
kind of
is smarter than Google, like you've got a problem. Like you're not smarter than Google. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. It's very tough. And I think I agree with you. I guess nowadays it would be much more difficult to rank, just text-based, posts on Google. I guess it's still possible. I mean, there's still people out there, buying content websites and just like applying their magic, and then, they get indexed much higher. But I think where you're like, your tendency to lean towards video also it makes a lot of sense, because I do think that's a big opportunity out there still. And it's something that if done right, there's very little competition. So one thing that you mentioned there is obviously now scaling this whole thing up. I guess now your sales funnel also looks vastly different than it looked like in the first couple of weeks and months, right? So maybe walk me through what does the sales funnel look like for anyone who's sitting there now in front of their laptop and they're like, let me actually try to start kind of an agency business like that too. What does it look like, and how can you, to what degree can you automate that?
It's tough to automate. So here's another, I'll kind of back up just a tiny bit to say, like, what gets you from $50,000 a year to $1 million a year? One of the other big answers to that question, besides building up more leads and bigger leads, is that you have to have a bigger package to sell. So we moved from selling one-off blog posts, like, hey, just, you want 1 or 2 blog posts? That's fine. We'll go do 1 or 2 blog posts, to you have to have a minimum of 12 pieces of content delivered over 3 or 4 months. Like longer term deals is a big part of how you scale up an agency. If you look at like the top tier agencies, very few, I would say like none of the top tier agencies charge you this little piecemeal thing. They're all on like a minimum monthly retainer that is very significant, right? And they do that for a reason, because like big companies kind of, that's how they tend to buy things. There's a bunch of stuff behind the scenes there. So anyway, we started to move to these bigger packages, and that attracts bigger companies that are looking at bigger budgets. It's funny, like a big company, when you...
So you're now also, most of your customers, are they on some kind of retainer, or...
So now what we do, so now what we do is a quarterly pilot, and then we go to year-long deals after that. And those are like kind of, you sign an annual contract for so many pieces of content plus content strategy and any add-ons and things like that. So it's a little more complicated. And then we also now do video content for clients. So like that, you throw that in, it's like more... But all that kind of slowly evolved over time, right? Like initially it was just like, we just want to like at least a minimum commitment of $10,000 or something like that at the beginning, just to like make sure that it was worth onboarding this client, having the people, do the work, getting to know their tool, all that stuff. So I think one big part of like growing and scaling an agency is figuring out how to take your average order size up. Now what happens there, and this is why reason I mentioned all this before we talk about the sales funnel, is a sales funnel for a $20,000 or $100,000 purchase is much different from a sales funnel for a $500 blog post. Just like absolutely different type of buyer, different level of vetting and questions you get. The kind of person who needs to be on the other end of the call is very different. So for example, a $500 or $1,000 product or offer, you probably shouldn't have a phone call. You don't have enough margin to do that. So you need it to be very self-service. But a $20,000 contract, a $50,000 contract, you absolutely have to have somebody who's on a call to get that started. And then you're going to have a champion on the client side. You're going to usually have a multi-part like buying committee essentially from your clients. So you got to get to know the lay of the land there, who all is going to actually be involved in this. So your salesperson has to be much more savvy about how business is structured and how like a bigger company makes these decisions. They also are going to have more legal review on your contracts. They're going to push back on specific, pieces of your contract or your statement of work. So you've got to like be prepared for all of this back and forth. So your sales cycle goes from, maybe in the early days when I'm selling a single blog post, people are like, yeah, I'll try it. Let's give you $1,000, whatever. But now it's like, instead of it being over a weekend, somebody decides that it's like 3 to 6 months of like back and forth. And with the really big companies, we've had 9 to 12 month sales cycles with some of them. So you've got to be ready for that sales cycle to be longer, and your phases get kind of drug out as well. Ours is typically going to be like, inbound comes in, they get on a initial discovery call for 30 minutes. We send over samples, we send over kind of our pricing and packages, how we typically recommend a pilot starts. Then they're going to come back and say, hey, we want to bring in 2 or 3 other people from the org to talk through it, so there's another 30-minute call at least. And then we typically get into signing. So again, this can take 1 month at maybe 2 to 4 weeks on the really short side for a small company. And then again, we've had some big clients that took 6 to 9 months or longer, I think, where they just, it sort of has to fall into their budget in certain timings and things. And there's all this this shit behind the scenes that we really have no control over. So we just have to stay on top of them. So it's a lot of follow-ups. It's a lot of sending them value. We now do monthly webinars as a way to engage those people who are kind of in our funnel, but not quite ready to buy. Stuff like that. You just got to start doing to nurture people just for longer periods of time.
And for you, what are very roughly the ticket sizes?
So our pilots right now are like $21,000 is kind of the lowest cost pilot we do for, it's like 12-ish pieces of content. There's a little bit of variability there. It depends on how complex and long pieces are, but that's roughly where we are today. And then, again, what we look at that pilot as a chance to evaluate the client and them to evaluate us. And so typically there's then a kind of price correction after that pilot. If like it was a terrible pilot and it took us way more work than we thought it would, and they want something custom, we'll raise that price and say, look, for you guys, because of the level of need you have, it's going to be higher, just FYI. And then if they don't sign, fine. But if they do, we at least know we've still got margin on it. And then similar, most often though, it's like you can get a discount for an annual commitment. And that's where, we typically know we're going to go with people.
Right. Now, obviously, if you sell something for 20K, 30, 40, 50, and so on, you need to be sure you're delivering the value, right? So I think most people listening to this, they will probably be more towards a pricing of starting from $500 to $2,000-$3,000, something like that. I guess is something where many people start off, right? Because that's something you can deliver. So for a price range like that, what, from your experience, how would you structure the sales process?
For those smaller packages, like the smaller $2,000 or $1,000 kind of commitment?
Right, yes.
Yeah. The biggest thing you have to think about is who is the buyer. So I'll give you an example here. Like a large company, a publicly traded company, to onboard a new vendor is a fairly good amount of work for both the party on the other side as well as the vendor. So we've gone through many times where we have full on security audits, even though we don't get access to anything on the client side. It's just they just have to have this checkbox, right? Well, they want our full tax returns and things like that, just to ensure we're solvent. It's kind of wild what they'll ask for. Now, for that level of work, no one wants to go through all that bullshit and paperwork for a $2,000 deal. So in other words, if you make your price point $500 to $2,000, you will not sell a large publicly traded company anything, period. And I mean, maybe if it's something they could put on their credit card as a discretionary expense, but you can't be a vendor for a big company for that deal, small of a deal. So part of what you have to think about is who is the buyer of a $2,000 service. And it's likely going to be very small businesses, early stage startups, mom and pop stores. And then you have to think about for them, what is the buying cycle and how many people are involved? Likely it's the founder, the CEO, the owner, whatever that kind of they're the final say, and they might have a marketing person or a, kind of a frontline person who's going to be your point of contact. So when you're in an organization that small, you're making that small of a sale, you really want to tighten up your sales process to be as quick a feedback cycle and a yes or no as possible. You can't waste 5 calls on somebody for a $2,000 deal. Your margin's gone because those 5 calls you got 2 hours worth of time at least booked into those calls. and you're only going to make $2,000. And let's say you're a really good agency and you're making 30-40% net margins, like $2,000. Anyway, it just eats it up. Like you're done. You can't hire a salesperson with that kind of model. So you got to figure out like how to turn it into something more self-service, or how to up your contract sizes and go work with bigger companies that can do longer term contracts.
Right. And maybe last question on the, on the cost side of things. What's the margin? You already mentioned 20 to 30%.
Yeah. So like we shoot for, I'll kind of break it down with draft.dev. And this is, I've kind of pulled these numbers from a lot of other conversations with content agency owners. And so there's a lot of variability. I'll say, like, just having a lot of these conversations, I've met agency owners who have 45 met people who have 45 to 55% net margins on everything they do, which is amazing. And then I met others who have like 5% net margins on everything at best, and sometimes not even that. So like, how we typically try, what we aim for at draft.dev is a 45% gross margin, getting down to somewhere around 15 to 20% net margin. It has been that some years, and then other year, like, honestly, our last year was our biggest revenue year, but our worst on the net margin side, because we hired a lot on the sales and growth side that didn't pan out. So like, that's one of those trade-offs you as an agency owner have to make, is like, how much net margin do I really want to make? Like, how much am I trying to just like siphon in cash and keep it versus reinvest that cash into growth? Because that comes off of your net margin when you go hire salespeople, you go put in more money into marketing. So there's a delicate balance there. I think my opinion on it and where I would go in the future has changed from where it was a couple of years ago. This is just like, I think it's been a good learning experience. I would be more firm about keeping my net margin at a certain number, no matter what, and not overspending on sales and marketing in the future if I were to do it again. But at the same time, like I couldn't have learned that lesson without doing it. So like, it was a good like experience to be like, to kind of burn it all and then make, oh shit, I shouldn't have spent all that money. but yeah, that's kind of where our numbers are roughly.
Yeah, very interesting. And Karl, would you already call that a productized service opportunity, like productized service offering, or is that something that we'll talk about now when we talk about your second business?
Yeah, so draft.dev is pretty productized. I mean, because it is like, the deliverable is so specific and well-defined. Like it is a $2,000 or 2,000 word blog post for X dollars, and then you multiply it by the number of blog posts you're going to get in the package. Now, we don't sell it quite the way some productized services do, where it's very like self-service or like, the unlimited design services that are so popular. They're typically going to be like a $500 to $2,000 a month recurring charge, and you log into a portal. You don't really ever talk to anybody. You just submit your request there, right? Like ours is a lot more hands-on because they're bigger total deals, but honestly, like it's not that dissimilar in its delivery mechanism. Behind the scenes, we have like a very like automated and processized sort of way to deliver on it. So I think when people talk about productized services, there's a lot of variability in the amount of productization and which sides of the business are productized. So what I mean by that is you could have a service that on the back end and the delivery side is very highly productized and very like operationalized, but on the front end, the sales side, it looks like a custom package you build for clients. And that's kind of what we've done with draft.dev, because we've been trying to move up market to bigger clients and bigger deals and have more long-term certainty. With the other business, and we can, kind of talk about that. I went through the process of buying another company that does podcast production. It's a little more like a typical-ish productized service where you just submit the work and we just bill you for each piece of work as it comes in. So there's pros and cons to that, but we can get into all that if you want.
Yeah. I mean, there's this brother, Hunter Hammond. Maybe you have heard about him with Sile Bloom. He's, their plan is to start up a new agency every month, right? And those are all very productized, like exactly what you're talking about, right? I mean, the whole sales funnel is so standardized. Typically, you hop on a waiting list, right? You indicate your willingness to pay, and then they contact the ones that have high willingness to pay, and basically close the deal either immediately via email, or sometimes they seem to hop on sales calls too. They do for example, the video editing agency from Ali Abdal, this Hey Friends. So it seems like there's this opportunity of productized services and building agencies around that. And then you can take it to one extreme where it's extremely productized, or you can do something where, there's a little bit more individuality and flexibility there. Maybe question for you, having built one agency like that and having bought another one, do you see niches where there's opportunity to build agencies like that for people listening who are now thinking about, okay, where should I attack? Or do you have a framework how people can think about finding these right opportunities?
Yeah. To me, it comes down to what does the customer want or willing to buy, and how do they want to buy this thing? So the unlimited design agency, I'm going to keep coming back to this because it's a good example of a very productized, very compartmentalized one, like you're talking about, where you join a waiting list, or you put in your email and say, I'm interested and I'm willing to pay. And they say either boom, you're right in, or here's one sales call and then you're in. So those work well when the customers are either small companies that just want to quickly get in and get a designer. They don't really have a lot of custom setup needs, or some big, they don't have a big vendor onboarding process. They're just okay with just doing that. Or it's a big company where you fit within somebody's discretionary budget and they're allowed to just work with a vendor like that, which depends on the company. But anyway, so it works well with that kind of customer, right? But it's not going to work well with some big company that has to have all these security checks behind the scenes and has to do all this stuff. They're going to, unless you have some kind of contact us for enterprise pricing type tier, which I think that's what a lot of them do as they grow. But you just need to think about who's the primary customer you're serving with this productized service first. And then however they want to buy is the way that you should design that cycle for them, and the way you design your service and delivery mechanism on the back end. So it's highly customized. Now, as far as opportunities, absolutely, there's tons of opportunities in this. I think so one of the big trends that I see in the coming decade that we've seen already start to happen, it's just going to continue happening more, is the end of that corner, the sort of big downtown corner agency. What I mean is, I live in Chicago in the US, and it used to be, if you were a medium to large company in Chicago, you would look downtown at who are the 5 big agencies that work in Chicago, and you'd go work with one of them. They'd be your agency of record, right? And they'd do everything, marketing and any PR and all that for you. They worked with tons of different industries. They worked in the city. They were kind of like your local hub, right? That's gone. There's no reason, COVID just killed all those. They all went remote. There's no reason to go with a big agency that's a generalist that does everything. So instead, what's happened, and this is the huge fragmentation in the marketing services space, is super easy for anybody to start up a really small, really niche agency that just works on one kind of deliverable for one kind of client. And that's what Draft.dev is. The Other Business Podcast Consultant's super similar in that it's just very specific thing that we do for a very specific type of client. And what's great about that from the business's perspective is they can own or they could even have a marketing strategy agency that tells them, here, you need to spin up a podcast, you need to write blog posts, you need to have a newsletter. And then they can say, great, well, now we'll just fractionalize all those things and go work with the agency who knows our industry that can manage those individual pieces of it. So it's really good because you get very specialized knowledge and very specialized sort of delivery of your services at the business level. And the agencies can be small, they can be super nimble, and they can be very highly focused and get really good at that. Whereas the old school model of the generalist downtown Chicago agency, they just had a bunch of they had this whole system of junior level people that kind of cut their teeth, and then you become a little higher level, and you slowly work your way up it. And they kind of I don't know, the whole thing, none of them knew, those people working at those marketing agencies, they don't know a specific industry that well unless they start to build up the expertise over time. Whereas instead with Draft.dev, we're hiring software engineers to do your marketing. How unique is that? No big agency does that. It doesn't make any sense for them. So it's just a really different approach. And I think it's really good in the highly specialized fields, especially, but I think it's going to be the way a lot of marketing goes. So that fragmentation of those small niches of agencies is a huge opportunity for people to launch productized services. I mean, I could see what we do with Draft.dev, content like this for law firms, for doctors' offices, for dentists, like any specialized field that requires some level of knowledge and maybe even certain certifications to write about. Like that's all. Like if you've got those skills or you know people that do, huge opportunities.
I want to talk about the second big chapter in your life, and that was essentially entrepreneurship through acquisition. It's a bit of a buzzword, but it has gained more and more popularity. Especially, I mean, there's this whole kind of movement from the world that I grew up in initially at the beginning of my career. It's like all these finance chads who are going to, doing their MBAs and then, for example, through search funds are acquiring businesses and becoming entrepreneurs, essentially. I have a couple of friends in my network who did exactly that. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work that well. But you essentially applied this framework of entrepreneurship through acquisition. You don't have a deep finance background, but you essentially managed to buy a company. It all went well so far.
Yeah, and, so far so good.
And it kind of seems like you can buy a company. You just need to put up a small amount of the total money. So explain a little bit how that works and why you jumped on that opportunity.
Yeah, I think a lot of entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs don't know about this avenue of getting into business for yourself. But, because typically you think like, oh, if I want to start my own business, I have to start it from scratch and I have to have the skills to do all the pieces of it to, work up to it. And I think there's a lot of value in doing that. I mean, you learn a lot along the way, but like there's also this path, which entrepreneurship through acquisition, where you can kind of skip some of the early steps and jump straight into something slightly bigger. And there's pros and cons to that. So the way it works, I similarly got exposed to it through some MBA grads I had met who were doing a search fund. And I thought it was really interesting just because I know, from my work with Draft.dev, starting that, I knew I had certain skills I was really good at. And I knew that a lot of small agencies and small businesses really struggle with some of those same things I'm good at. Like, for example, like compartmentalizing my time and outsourcing and, sort of segmenting off the role into things I can give to other people. I'm really good at that. I'm really disciplined about that. Whereas a lot of agency owners, they do everything because they just don't see a way to get it off their plate. Right. And they don't charge enough. They don't raise prices. They don't, think about the real unit economics of how this thing models out as you get bigger. And I don't have a finance background. I just know that like there's, small businesses are not that complicated to look at financially. Like under $1 million, it shouldn't be that hard. But anyway, so I got into this and I was like trying to think to myself, like, how do I want to build a bigger like sort of business, but I didn't, there's only so much space for growth where Draft.dev is. It's a niche industry. It can only get so much bigger on its own. It's already one of the biggest players in that space, but it's a small space. So like, what else do we do? So we started looking, I got together with a partner, a friend of mine I've known for years. And I was like, let's find a way to go buy more companies like Draft.dev. They're super specialized and conglomerate them together, share some of the back office resources and scale these things up, like have a whole portfolio of these things. The ETA, entrepreneurship with acquisition and holding company have gotten really in vogue lately, but like nobody was doing it, or I hadn't seen many people doing it quite the way I was looking at it. And so I figured, let's give it a shot. So we got together, we figured out like, we want to buy something in the podcast production space. I think that the quick and easy thesis for this was, I think more businesses will have podcasts in 10 years than do today. I think a lot of the podcasts now are hobbyists, which is cool, but they're not going to be sustainable. They won't ever make much money and people will burn out on it. But what kinds of places, it's like blogs, like what has now dominated search results in blogs have been business blogs because they have the money to actually invest into this and they get value from it, versus it used to be 10, 20 years ago, it was the personal blog was the typical like blog was like all, individuals. So I kind of see that same trend in podcasting.
Man, so it seems like we need to do this podcast really right. Otherwise you're painting a, bad picture here about the next couple of years.
There's exceptions, obviously, right? Like I was just listening to Tim Ferriss's podcast and he was talking about some of the economics of that. Like guy makes pretty good money. So like clearly it does work and it's kind of a hobbyist show in a way. Like it's just him having interesting conversations with entrepreneurs. But the long story short is I think like more businesses will have their own podcasts, especially in certain niches. And so we started looking at podcast production agencies and we ran it like a search fund does, but what they call self-funded search, which means we didn't go find investors. We were just going to put up the money ourselves and do the effort ourselves to find a business. We went and talked to probably 50 to 100 small podcast production agency owners over the course of 6 to 8 months or something like that. I just found them on LinkedIn. I started reaching out. I said, hey, I own an agency, super interested in the podcast space, would love to talk to you about buying your company if you're interested. And you get a pretty decent hit rate when you're just like legitimately want to talk to people. I wasn't like, I'm some big shark who's going to eat your company up. I'm just another small business owner, right? So just use that to my advantage. And it got a lot of good conversations. The company we ended up buying is called The Podcast Consultant, thepodcastconsultant.com. Great business, has 80 clients, very long-term relationships with those clients, had a team of 24. So production and editorial people to do all the sort of audio work, because audio and video now, but like, I didn't know anything about editing a podcast. Like at a high level, I understand how podcasts can work and fit into a marketing strategy, but like I've never edited audio. And so it was interesting coming into this business, like unlike draft.dev where I did every single role at one point, I came into this and I have no idea how to do any of the roles other than maybe sales, arguably. And so that's it definitely is hard in certain ways, because as an entrepreneur, I always want to know that I can, like, worst case scenario, I'll roll up my sleeves and do the work, right? But like, I can't. I don't know how I would edit any shows. Like I'm just not able to do that. But I think I've grown as an entrepreneur to think more in terms of the who, like who can I get to do this, and can I get them to do it profitably, instead of how do I do this? Like how do I roll up my sleeves and become the one doing it? So anyway, that was the big lesson there. And just seeing that play out over the last 9 months has been extremely encouraging, just because it's worked really well. We've grown the business a tiny bit. And it hasn't been like a bloodbath where we lost all our clients or anything crazy like that. So it feels good. And the team has all stayed around too. Like we're still working with the same people. They're awesome. The former owner is out, but he's awesome. Like just helpful if we ever need him. We've had a good relationship. It's just like, I can't say enough good things about it. Now, some of that's luck. Some of it's, we did a lot of good due diligence, but like it is a thing you can do. You can go buy a business, and you only have to put with the kind of, I don't know, you want to talk financials on it? Because I think you like to get into the hard numbers.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to go, basically. So
okay.
Yeah, like what was the price? How much, of your own equity did you put in? How much cash was there involved? And also what I would be interested in is what's the range? Like what's the smallest business size that you could buy that makes sense? Like the smallest deal value, so to say. Because I'm sure there's people who, let's say they have 100K in the bank and they're like, can I already apply this strategy, or is this too early? Do I need more? Can I even do it with less? So that would be interesting to explore that a bit. Yeah,
that's a really good question. So start with the way that, like, the financials and how this breaks down. And in our case, there's a very good book on this called Buy Then Build. Which has kind of been the search fund Bible that sort of they've all started with. Now there's some information that's a little out of date now, but like it's generally speaking a very good book from like a structural standpoint of setting up these deals. So the way that this works, and this all only applies to US people, by the way, like unfortunately I don't know anything about how these loans would work in other countries, but the US has this program called the Small Business Administration Loan Program. And essentially it is the SBA loans are backed, or at least like they're backed essentially, like there's a backstop with the federal government that allows a bank to give out a very small, very risky loan they would normally never do to somebody like me, with the assurance that even if Karl defaults and they have to take all my assets, the federal government's kind of backing it up at the very end. So like they're okay with the level of risk on it. So typically small bank, or any bank, would not give a person like me without a ton of collateral a big loan, like $1 million loan to buy a business. And especially if I only have 10% down, this is not going to happen. So the SBA makes that possible. Anyway, so the way we structure this is very typical.
And on top of that, you also look like a quite risky fellow to lend some money. So, I can understand.
I'm going for that look,
One thing I wanted to add though, like because I was interrupting you, one thing I wanted to add is, for people from Germany, for example, listening, there's a very similar dynamic with a bank called KfW. I just wanted to add that. I'm pretty sure for other countries, I also don't know, but I'm sure a lot of other countries also have this kind of mechanism. So please keep going. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, definitely look into it, because so the way it works in the US, it's let's say you want to buy $1 million business. You're going to put at least 10% down. So $100,000, that's a good starting like chunk. And then the rest of it can either be all SBA loan financed potentially. So you have 90% SBA loan, or you can do a blend of SBA loan and what they call seller financing, which if you've never looked into business acquisition, seller financing is super common. But essentially what seller financing means is the person who sells me the business is sort of like willing to take money back over time. So the way ours was is 10% down, 15% of it is seller finance, meaning we are paying the seller money every month to essentially buy that last portion of it. And then the remaining portion, the 70% that's left, what did I get to? No, 75% that's left is an SBA loan. So that is paid out to our bank that services it or whatever. And that's done monthly. And, the interest rate is variable. There's a lot of things that people don't like about SBA loans. The biggest thing that gets entrepreneurs who are new at this is that you put up essentially a personal guarantee, meaning that if this business fails and falls apart and I can't pay it back to the business, I have to pay it no matter what. And they're going to take my personal assets. They could take my, a house, car, anything you own. So you just do need to be aware there is risk there. And like, this is it's not free money. It's not something where if the business fails, you can just kind of like back out and you've got no problems. It is pretty risky. But that said, again, I already was running one business that was making pretty good money and doing well. And I with a partner, I felt very confident that we could go into another business that had consistent performance over time and just at least keep it up. Now, if we grow the business, we'll be able to pay the loan off faster, and we'll be able to be free of that sooner than the 10-year term that typically takes. But that's kind of the economics of it. Now, how small, your question about like how small of a business can you buy with an SBA loan like this? There's not really like a lower limit from the technical financial side of things. It's more a question of how involved do you want to be? Because almost certainly the smaller that small business is, the more the owner is the sort of driving engine of the business. We wanted something big enough that it had a team that could do at least the production side of things, but we wanted to come in and apply our knowledge and expertise and networks on the sales and marketing side to take over that part of it. So I knew on day zero, I was going to take over sales, and I knew I would be like kind of the sort of customer support if I had to be. My partner knew he was going to take over marketing and overseeing the operational side of things. And we were okay with that. We didn't come into this under false pretenses like there's going to be some general manager who runs it that does everything for us. Like we didn't think we were going to be passive. We're absolutely involved in this day to day. But with the hope that we build it up to a size where we can afford to get a little more out of the day to day every year. So that's kind of how we looked at it. If you buy something, under $1 million, like we did, this was like $750,000 purchase-ish. Just round numbers. And I have a blog post too that you can link to that has like the whole sort of process laid out and all the numbers behind the scenes. But, something like that size, we knew we were going to be involved. If you buy something bigger, like a lot of search fund people will look to buy something more like $4 to $8 million in like total size. And that size, you probably have an executive team that's fairly competent and able to do a lot of the day-to-day management, and you can kind of be a more true CEO. So it depends what you want. Obviously, there's a huge amount of risk in buying a business that big because you're taking out a huge loan for it. That's why they typically will also get investors to help cover some of that down payment and the loan as well. But yeah, pros and cons there.
Yeah, and for ambitious chimps at the university or, just started their first job, listening to this, sure, you can also buy businesses for a couple of thousands or tens of thousands. If you scroll through Flippa, for example, there's tons of them. And I was guilty of looking at those too in the very early days of my career. But what I noticed there is like the amount of garbage is extremely high.
Absolutely.
On that price end, right? So, the higher the prices, the more you can kind of, the easier it gets to get a business that is somehow run solidly and is not a complete scam, right? But if you buy a business for a couple of K, you really need to do your due diligence, right? And then the question is that, all that time and effort you put into that even worth it? Or should you just throw some product on the market, sell it for 1K a pop, and start with that, right?
Right.
So because I get this question a lot from people.
We talked to agency owners who had like, they were making like 250,000 or 500,000 a year in revenue, and that's small. It's like they were paying themselves, and then a couple freelancers. That was like the whole company, right? And that is very small and very hard to take over, because if one of those two freelancers leaves, then where's the backup plan, right? That's like back to us, like we're going to be editing audio files, and that was really what we were trying to avoid. And then, when you look at something that small, you're like, why don't I just make this myself? Like, most of these businesses are not that defensible. There's not some unique technology that makes them that hard. It's like the real value there is the long-term relationships with clients and the steady cash flow that they have. So something that has very small cash flow is like, well, I could just go start my own podcast production agency, hire a freelancer, and probably get to $100,000 in 6 months if I wanted to do it that way. And that saved me a lot of money from buying one. So I think you do have to think about that. The other thing that comes into play here is how you value small companies. And I think this question comes up to me a lot when people ask about it. There's sort of this, in the world of buying businesses, there are these industry standard or business standard multiples that people use. When you hear an investor or somebody talk about multiples for valuations, what they're referring to typically is businesses are typically bought and sold on a multiple of their what either called EBITDA, which means it's essentially net profit. I'm going to dumb it down to just like, it's the amount of money they make at the end of the year. So if a business makes $100,000 a year net profit, and you want to buy it for a 3x multiple, you would pay $300,000. So it doesn't matter how much top line it has. It only matters how much net profit EBITDA it has. And the reason that is such an important metric is like, a lot of people think like if they hear big valuations from places like SaaS companies that sell, like software companies that sell, and those are often traded, they can be traded in a hot market, especially on multiples of revenue. So they look really big. It could be 5x their annual revenue or something crazy like that. But that's not the way at all. It happens in a typical small service business or, any local business. So just knowing where your industry multiples are realistically, and then making sure your seller knows what those industry multiples are, being realistic with them is huge. Like I remember having a lot of conversations with sellers who had never thought about selling. And I'm telling them, I'm walking them through the numbers. I'm like, your business makes this much a year. I'm going to give you 3 times that. And that's going to be you're going to get that, and that's it. And then you pass the business on. Some people were like, ooh, that's not a lot of money, like they realize like they're selling their life's
especially
work
after
essentially.
taxes and everything.
Yeah. And they're selling their life's work for what amounts to 3 years of salary for them, essentially. So you just knowing that like those numbers, the multiples that companies trade at, the different sizes and types of companies is all really important. And you can go out and find industry data that helps you with that. But like just making sure everybody's on the same page with what that is. And I was always very upfront with sellers. Like that was almost in the first call. I would tell them, I'm probably going to offer you a 3x multiple on your SDE or your net profit. Just, are you okay with that? Does that make sense? And think about that,
Now you bought a productized service business, but there's so many other types of businesses out there, right? You already mentioned SaaS. There's like, you can buy content websites. You were talking about, could even buy some offline businesses, e-commerce, whatever. You are an absolute programming whiz, so you could also take on something more technical, right? Why did you decide, I guess the question is, why did you decide for productized service? And then can you distinguish, or can you like draw the landscape for people listening to this? What are some other types of businesses that were not right for you, but might be right for other people for whatever reason?
You're kind of getting at one of the big questions that a lot of people struggle with in entrepreneurship is like, why are you doing it? I think so as an entrepreneur, if you haven't started, you have no business yet, like you're often just thinking, man, if I could make $1 million a year I own a company that makes $1 million a year and pays me out $250 a year or $250,000 a year, I'd be so happy. Like you just think that in your head. I thought that when I started Draft.depth, I was like, that would be amazing. I'd just go live on a beach and I'd let the thing make me money. Right. But like I got there in 2 years and I was like, wait, I don't want to go live on a beach. I want to fucking go. Like, let's go find something else to build. Let's do something cool. Like, I got to do something bigger. So I think what's important for me is to find a long-term big vision that is going to take a lot to get to. So I was a software engineer for 10 years. I knew how to build software. Should I use that skill? Like, yeah, maybe, but also like, I kind of did that. Like I learned enough about it. I'm done. One of the things I found about myself, Kevin, is like, I just like to learn things, and I like to learn them up to about 80%. And then I'm okay not knowing that last 20% and letting experts do that. Like, I just like that first 80% of learning. And I used to think this was a weakness. I used to be so afraid to admit that, like in job interviews, because like, you're supposed to be the expert. You're supposed to get deep into all your knowledge. And like, man, fuck that. I don't want to do, like, I just want to get to know a bunch of stuff, really interesting, like be very like widely skilled. So look, I'd been a software engineer. I felt like I was at 80% of being a software engineer. I don't need to go the next 20% that takes me 30 years to get to. Like, I don't want to do that anymore. Same with like, starting one agency. I'm
exactly the same, and just like shortly interrupting, but I'm exactly the same. And sometimes I also feel like it's a weakness because sometimes you want to go super deep into something, but I'm often more the type of person that, I like to look at a broad set of things and go in there 80% or 90%. Yeah, I guess there's other people, they like their brains are just structured in a different way that they can look at a certain problem set for be it days, weeks, months, or years. I'm just not like that, and but it's refreshing to hear that you're like that, and there's many other successful people out there.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of successful people that are both either way, and there's no right and wrong. It's just like know what you are and accept it, and be okay with the trade-offs of that. So I classify them. I used to do this when I managed engineers too. Engineers are like this, where some are farmers and some are pioneers. What I mean is, a farmer is great when you give them a field that's like got crops like ready to go. They tend that thing every year. They make it 10% better every year. They really love that field. They want to live in that field. You know what I mean? Like they live in that dirt. And then on the other hand, you have pioneers, and I'm a pioneer. You're a pioneer. It's like, I want to go out there and plow the next field and then get the hell out and let the farmer take over for the day-to-day work. Like, I want to go find the next field. I don't care about like, I'm the guy who's like moving 3 miles further west every single year to get across the Great Plains, right? So I think like knowing which one you are and admitting it to yourself, and then saying, how do I build a journey as an entrepreneur that takes me on the right path, is so critical to being happy along the way. Because money, the bigger business you run doesn't make you happy. The money doesn't make you happy, really. I mean, you're going to make enough at some point that you just, I don't know, like you can spend
and
it,
that's a very controversial statement on this show, to say money doesn't make you happy.
I think the pursuit of bigger and bigger things absolutely can make you happy. I don't think that money is a bad metric to allow you to say you want to build bigger things, but I don't think the money on its own, pure and simple, just makes you happy. Or very few people doesn't do that. So anyway, knowing what makes you happy.
I think it's a bit like a game. Many people see money, I think, as a score
it's a scorecard
in a game,
absolutely, right? Yeah. And I still use it. I use it as a scorecard. Like, I mean, so when I started working with a coach, Draft.dev is doing great. I took a whole month off when my second kid was born, and I was like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, I don't even have to be in this business and it makes me money. Like, this is the dream. Like, everybody says that's the dream. Like, you did it. And then I was like, but I'm not like any happier. I'm just still like the same person, right? Like, I still want to do bigger things. So I start working with a coach, and he pushes me on this, and I'm like, yeah, I got to set something really big that feels like I have to have a big scorecard to aim for. Because if I just do like, I want to make 2 million, next year I want to make 3 million, next year I want to make 4 million, like, who cares? This is all little incremental changes. But like, so anyway, he pushed me on this, and this was what got me into the acquisition thing, was build a $100 million portfolio of at least 10 companies over the next 10 years. How are you going to do that? I don't know. Well, I don't know how I'm going to do that today either, but like, I know that there's like one foot in front of the other, and there's a few steps like ahead of me that I kind of see plotted out, and I'll kind of figure the next steps out once I get a little further down. And like, so having a big goal that's like, again, it's money tied, but it's not really about the money for me. It's about the learning. Like, learning to build a $100 million portfolio will require a fantastic amount of learning. And I don't have any clue. Like, I'll have to learn to become a fundraiser. I'll have to learn to become a buyer of many businesses and set up an organizational structure that knows how to buy businesses better than I could on my own. Like, I don't know how to do any of that shit, but like, that's exciting. That's what's fun. That's what keeps me going at this every day. So I think like knowing what your big thing is you're shooting for, even if you're early on, even if you're like just cracking the like profitability level where you can like pay yourself, like, is really important to stay motivated, because again, like you can make more and more money, but is that all you're doing it for? Or do you want something different? Is like, be honest with yourself. Like, what are you trying to optimize for, and how big are you really trying to go?
Yeah. I love it, man. Let's return to the question of like the different types of businesses that people could buy, maybe like the pros and cons, SaaS, e-com, content, and so on. What are like the different types, or like the main types that you see out there, and why are they good or bad opportunities for people?
Yeah. So service businesses like we bought are cheap to buy for the amount of revenue that you get, and the amount of net profit that you get typically. So in other words, you're paying a low multiple on net profit for a service business like we bought and that I own. So the upside to it is that they're cheap, and you can quickly like buy a company that makes you $100,000 a year to live on, or something like that, whatever your minimum is. That's the good thing. The downside is they don't sell for that much either. So you could spend many years grinding in it and growing, and they could still sell for a 3 or 4 times multiple of net profit. Now, if you get really big, you can get higher numbers, and there's ways to do, different things. But like, point is like, you're not going to have some big exit. So, you want to just optimize those for cash flow, and that's what we're doing. So that's totally fine. Just know that that's the trade-off. You also will probably have to be in the sales role until you get to at least $1 million in revenue, probably more like $1.5 million to $2 million. You'll have to have some level of sales oversight. Just in my experience with agencies, very few agencies does the founder get out of sales until they hit those numbers. Maybe there's exceptions, but whatever. Productized, the more productized the agency is, the easier it is to get out of that day-to-day and deliverables. The more operationalized it is behind the scenes, the more it's got good processes and people and all that, like the better. So like all that's good stuff, and that might increase the multiple just a little bit, but it doesn't make the agency financially that much different at the end of the day than one that is a little more bespoke. It's just easier to buy and like sort of get started with. And then you've got SaaS, like we mentioned, where the multiples are much higher. So they're more expensive to buy relative to the amount of revenue and net profit that you get. But their net profit numbers can be huge. I mean, some of the best, like the big SaaS companies can be operating at like, I don't know, like 50% to 75% net profit. Like it's crazy. It's like just huge. Once they get really spun up and scaled, they're extremely valuable. So that's why they trade at such high multiples as well, is that the potential there is great. But the problem, again, comes down to like, how do you buy a SaaS that's big enough that you don't have to do everything? Buying a SaaS that like, you have to think it's got to have at least a couple $100,000 of net profit to just hire one full-time engineer. Now you maybe outsource that and go with something cheaper, but you run some other risks of like, how reliable are they and how good are they? You have to know all that. If you're an engineer yourself, like a software engineer, and you can maintain it all yourself and do all the customer support yourself, you can buy something smaller. But otherwise, you got to buy something where it's got at least enough to sustain a couple people. And so then you're going to end up paying a lot of money for that. And so you run into some limits with financing those. And then there's a lot of stuff that's kind of in the middle. There's SaaS companies that have a large service component. So maybe they do primarily offer SaaS, but like 50% of the revenue is like servicing those companies where they do custom work as well. That kind of thing. It gets tricky to value those, and you have to decide how you want to go about it. But like those are not that uncommon. And then you have a lot of things like e-commerce. I don't know as much about how e-commerce ones trade, but that's another industry you can look at. And again, if you have like good connections in e-commerce, I had a friend actually recently just bought a e-commerce brand where he owns a marketing agency already that does a lot of work with e-commerce brands and helps grow them. This was one of their clients, and they had done a good job with this, like getting this product with all this IP. It's like a very like unique product built, but they never really did a good job of marketing it. And they were kind of like, we're sort of done with this one. Like this one seems too hard. So they sold it to my friend with the marketing agency. And he said, well, great, I get to plug my agency in and scale this thing up. And then I'm using this IP that's like got me a little bit of a moat. So it's not going to be replicated quickly by other people. And he's kind of using his strength to grow that. So I think that's an option if you can find the right product that has like, low market penetration, but you think you can reach a market or something like that. Yeah, those are the ones you see most often. Then content sites, we had talked about that. That I don't know where that industry is going either. I haven't kept up with it. I used to look at that stuff a little more. I think it's going to be tough in the next few years because of the way that SEO is going. It's just like that. The model used to be for content sites, you create thousands of pieces of relatively low quality content to capture like volumes of searches from Google over time. And then you try to make affiliate dollars off of people clicking links in there to buy things, or you run ads on them. And that has worked really well at some points in the internet's history. And it has gotten hugely penalized by Google at other points in history, like right now, I think. So there's probably people out there making a shitload of money on content sites that would prove me wrong. And I don't think it's impossible or anything like that. I just think it's like, it is tough to break into right now. And Google's quality levels for content expectations are getting higher and higher. I don't know if you see anything different, Kevin. I'd be curious to hear, because you probably talk to more people.
No, I've interviewed someone a couple of days ago, and he said he does think there's still potential in content sites, but he was referring more to like a very low level of income. So I think for someone who is just like someone who's at the university right now and they're like, let me make a couple of $100 or $1,000. I think you can go super niche on whatever freaking topic, like just as niche as possible, pump out some content, obviously utilize AI to your benefit. You probably can make some money there, right? But it's nothing, I agree with you. It's nothing where I would say, okay, let's build the next multi-million-dollar business on top of that. I don't know enough about that. Maybe it's possible, but just like from my gut feeling, it feels difficult. It feels a bit like, I don't know, do you know about the faceless channel industry on YouTube?
No.
So that's like this movement that started a couple of years ago where there's people who create YouTube content in niches that are extremely undersaturated. So they will find like a niche where they see there's a lot of interest in content in that niche, but there's just not any channels serving that kind of content. And then what they do is they hire video editors, script writers, typically very low quality. So like in these early days of content websites, like shitty blog posts, right? So they create these, in like majority is pretty shitty videos, but the videos gain traction nonetheless, right? Because if you're the first one posting like a video about the Hells Angels every day on YouTube, and there's people searching for that kind of stuff, you get content. And then oftentimes it's also the kind of audience. So if your audience is like, your demographic is 50 or 60-year-old American males, they are not used to the kind of content production quality that probably 20 or 30-year-olds will expect, right? Yeah. And then what happens is you milk the market for a couple of months, you make a couple of $1,000s in AdSense money with these channels, but sooner or later, the niche fills up, it gets saturated, and then it becomes a game of quality again. Yeah. And lately there has been like a wave of YouTube cracking down on some of these channels. So that's reminiscent of what happened with these low quality content websites, right? That also kind of got they got deranked on Google, for example, or just scored down. So that just reminds me of that.
Yeah. This whole, like all these choices, a lot of times people try to boil down what kind of business should I start based on like the potential profitability or exit plan or whatever. I would scrap that idea and instead start to think, what do I have a unique advantage in that I could do a better business than a lot of other people? So what I mean by that is like, if you're early in your career, you probably have the unique advantage, like I did, of you're just willing to try a lot of shit and waste a lot of time because you have the energy and like time to just go like do side projects all night, right? Like when I was in my 20s, there's a blog post I wrote about like 10 little random side projects I started before I actually made a successful business. And they were all just because I had a lot of time on my hands and I was trying things out. None of them were good ideas or whatever, but like that energy of trying things was my asset. That's all I had. I didn't have like any money. I didn't have any network. All I had was time. So I just used that. Like, that's great. Now, on the other hand, if you're somebody later in your career, you've already had a career of 10 or 20 years, you have a lot of career skills that people at that early stage don't have. So how do you leverage those career skills, maybe some of the saved up cash you have, to make a better business than somebody who's 20 years old that can try 30 YouTube niches a week? Like that's not the business for me because my time is too valuable. I got 2 kids now. I don't have any free time. I'm not making low quality YouTube channels, like not going to be my business. Right. But like something like Draft.dev that took my unique knowledge in software engineering and writing and sort of merged them together, I had a huge leg up versus anybody else who wanted to start that business, other than the few hundred other engineers who want to write content, you know? So I think like knowing what your unique advantage is and just thinking about how you could apply that. So if you're looking at buying a business, like if you have a great network in a certain industry or whatever, and you can take that network and plug it into an existing business, that's going to be phenomenal versus buying a business you think is just a good, profitable business and you know nothing about the industry or the customers or how you'd grow it or whatever. Like figure out some way to use your unique skills to get the most leverage out of it as possible. I think people look at that as like cheating, but that's all entrepreneurship is like maximizing leverage. It's just such it's what everybody does. So like you look at a really well-known entrepreneur like an Elon Musk, like he doesn't use his time to go start businesses. He maximizes leverage he has through other people and existing cash flows and access to investors to do whatever he wants. Like it's just like, again, you got to shift your thinking away from, I got to learn how to do everything. And, you know, like I have to be the brain on everything and just think like, how do I leverage what I have and just not do as much work to make it more successful?
All right, Karl, I want to hear how much money are you making? So essentially, tell me what is like, how does it look like, right? You have these margins. I mean, you say one business is making 2.5 million and so on. So like, what's the margin? And then in the end, do you pay yourself out? Does the money stay in the company? And like just roughly what gets into your bank account at the end of the day?
So listen, I'm trying to think of this from last year. Draft.dev was actually down a bit from its peak of 2.5 million. I think it was closer to 2 million in revenue. And it did something like 10% net margin. I think is right around there, somewhere between 8 and 11. I don't remember. But then a lot of that cash though got reinvested into buying this other business. And it's like, it's funny when you look at like business finances are so, to answer your question is complicated because like business finances are kind of fucking complicated. And like, I'm not trying to evade it. It's just like, which number do you want? Because they all could look different depending on how you spin it. So, you take 2 million, you say 10%.
It's really like net. This. And it's like, what I always say is like when people ask me or anyone else, like, what's your net worth? A person that can clearly answer this question probably doesn't have a high net worth because it's actually pretty fucking damn difficult to
hard.
Estimate a net worth.
Yeah. Because like, how do you value these small businesses? Is it on their market value or fair market value? Which apparently, there's differences in that. Anyway. But no, to answer your question, I'm not evading it. Like, say we got 2 million in top line, you got 200K net revenue, about 100K of that went into expenses and getting set up to buy this other business. And so like there's a big chunk of it and another 100K or so is paid to me, roughly speaking. We don't keep a lot of cash in the business because it's not necessary. It's not like we basically want to just keep a couple of months of salaries for people in there just in case. But like our receivables are always high enough that there's no need to keep a ton of extra cash. And unless we were planning on another acquisition or something, we wouldn't really need to. So that's how that's all worked. The other business that we bought, I think last year, somewhere around, because we bought it partway through the year. So I think it probably did around 500K in total top line. We actually have much higher margins over there. I think it's like 30-40% net margins because it's smaller. It has less fewer layers of management, which that's a whole other conversation you can get into, like what those margins should be as you grow. They actually, some cases they kind of can go down depending on that. Anyway, so like, but we used a lot of that to pay off early, like our loans for that we took out to buy the business, right? So we made a big chunk of payment on our loans with that. So we didn't take home anything from it. We've kept it all in the business or paid loans with it. So, my partner and I both, our outlook is very much long-term here. Like we're young, we're fortunate that we have, wives, significant others that also make money. And so like, we don't have to maximize our personal income, which is nice. Also, I'm very fortunate here in the US, my wife has health insurance. I only have to cover that for myself. Like a lot of things like that there's benefits to having a significant other that I wouldn't have had earlier in life, right? Like now I have this like unfair advantage of like a significant other who makes good money and has health insurance. So anyway, there's like, we take home what we need, but we're also pretty simple in our like living at this point because we're trying to pump as much back into the business as we can for the next acquisition and for long term. Because again, we look at this like normal people look at like all their excess income goes into a retirement account and a 401k, and maybe we put a little bit into IRAs and things, but like we don't maximize that because our biggest ROI investment we have, like biggest ROI for anything we have, is this business we're building. Because if you truly believe that we're going to build $100 million portfolio in 10 years, then that's going to be worth way more than anything I could throw into an IRA. So that's my philosophy on it at this point. I'm in. Are you familiar with Entrepreneurs Organization? You know what that is? EO.
Yeah. EO.
Yeah. So I'm in EO, and I'm in a forum with a lot of older guys in 40s, 50s, and creeping up on 60, and their priorities are different. Understandably so, right? Like they're looking more at like, how do I maximize my take home and sort of my nest egg for when I inevitably sell or retire from this thing. And so I think you got to look at your stage of life and figure out what you're maximizing for, and be honest with yourself. Like, keeping my personal burn rate down is a huge priority, just because I really want to be able to maximize investment in this thing, because this, I feel like, has so much more potential than any other things I can buy right now. But that's just me.
I'm a huge proponent of this philosophy too. I think it's like, even in terms of maximization of personal luck and, being happy, I think the best thing you can do is live a rather minimalist life. I mean, of course, I will. Yeah. I also spend money on expensive stuff, and some things are just important for me, so I'll spend a lot of money on them, and probably more than other people. But I think I hope I never get to the point in my life where I have like 10 homes and I have 20 cars, and I think that's like necessary for my luck, because I think this just probably destroys you. I think like the best thing you can do is live a rather normal, maybe a bit above normal life. Like, buy the stuff that is extremely important to you, but apart from that, try to keep it low. And then from time to time, you can just like go crazy, maybe, go on a crazy luxury vacation or whatever.
Yeah,
but
spend it where you want to, not where people tell you to. I think, have you ever read The Millionaire Next Door? That's another one that is kind of a good like perspective shift on money. It basically is just about like how a lot of people who are extremely wealthy and have high net worths don't look like they do from the outside. And it's partly by design, but it's also partly they don't just like blow money the second they have it. They're really smart about how to redeploy it to make more money. And so that means living a relatively it doesn't look that ostentatious of a life, but like they can go spend $100,000 on a vacation. Like, I met a guy not long ago who's done very well for himself, sold businesses. You would talk to him on a Zoom call and like go to his house and not think anything like he's just had a normal $200,000 a year job for the last few years. You'd think he's just a very simple guy. And that's good money, right? Like he's I'm not saying he's poor. It's just like, he doesn't look like he's that wealthy. And he's telling me about these vacations he goes on. He goes on to Antarctica, which is $150,000 trip, like a 6-month Antarctica trip, like where he spends all this money and like has personal guides and like he's seeing things that like 100 people in the world have seen. And just like, okay, so that's where he's spending it. Like, he's just decided, like, I don't need to be a big house. I don't need to have like the fancy cars, but I want to go spend a ton of money and go to Antarctica or whatever. So like, I think the entrepreneurs get this freedom to like decide what it is we want to prioritize. And we're kind of the same. We spend a fair bit of money on travel, but like also, we don't have like a fancy new car, because right now it's not something we care to prioritize. We don't have a massive house with a huge yard or something. It's just not something we need at the moment. Anyway, you just got to decide what's right for you.
I was on this congress with my mentor in China, and it was this political business congress, whatever. And he told me, like, we were walking through the room, and he told me, this guy over there, he's a very, very wealthy billionaire. And I was looking, there was like multiple people, and like there was one person in particular that was wearing these, almost like these Hello Kitty sweatpants and like this hoodie, and just looked completely out of fucking place. And I knew that's the guy, and then I asked him, and he said, yeah, like that's him, And especially in China, I noticed that when I went, to clubs or whatever, like the people that look the weirdest, or sometimes just the like super normal, they wearing some sweatpants, whatever, they don't give a fuck. They have, be careful, they have the most money, so that's, that was funny to see. I have one more.
That's like, yeah, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
No, I just think that's one of those traits of entrepreneurs. Like we're unafraid to think differently, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, 100%. I have one last question to kind of round up this productized service business chapter. What are the first people that you would recommend hiring if you are just starting out? And let me give you a case here. So what we've been doing with my company over the past couple of months was essentially just building YouTube channels, like high quality channels, productions, mostly of documentaries. And one channel, for example, is we're working with the German TV, national TV. So they are financing us. And we have other channels that are very successful. Now, what we decided 2 or 3 months ago is, hey, if we can build these channels for our own portfolio, maybe it makes sense to build channels for companies too. Because if you look at most companies' websites, they have some kind of YouTube channel, but in 99% of the cases, it's pretty shit. Right? So we're like, okay, let us turn that into an a service, and it's selling well. But if I give you a glimpse behind the scenes, of course we have a team of 30 people, video editors and script writers and thumbnail designers and stuff like that. So this kind of stuff is covered, but then I still need to be involved with each and every single client to make sure like the small things, right? Where I'm like, actually, no, let's first produce this title, or let's, make the content strategy like this. So my involvement is still required. So now I could hire someone who replaces me. That's probably 10, 15,000 per month. If I want a high quality person, I could hire like a salesperson, because we don't have a dedicated salesperson right now. Maybe I could hire someone else. So what do you think? How would you approach something like that?
Yeah, hiring a sales, like outsourcing sales, is like the hardest role to outsource, just because in the early days you learn so much on those early customer calls and through the customer support, questions and stuff like that, like about how the service is being done and how like people perceive it, and the sort of psychology of the buyer, which is so valuable when you're building your marketing and you're building your sales process and all that. So like, I can't speak to your specific situation just because there's so many ifs and, questions, but I'll tell you how I think about it. When I started Draft.dev, the first year and a half was 100% me selling. And it was great. I think I had at least 200 sales calls in that year and a half, which if you can have that volume of sales calls over a year and a half, you will learn so much about what your target buyers want and don't want and who they are. And I built out personas from that. That allowed me to build a pitch, like a deck that I could sort of use and then pass on to a salesperson. It allowed me to build the follow-up sequences that we need after sales calls to kind of set up our initial CRM and all that. Like, so having hundreds of sales calls will lead to you being able to set up all this collateral. And that's, I think, what is necessary to bring a salesperson in to then actually continually execute it. I think bringing a salesperson too early, you expect them to go learn all that stuff and be the entrepreneur. And that's like, that's not going to be their role. That's not a salesperson. That's your role as an entrepreneur. So like you have to, and again, it's different for every business. I don't know what the answer in your case is, but for me, it's like, I want to know that sale so well that I can define it and know, like, here's a box, give it to a salesperson and say, now you go take this box and run with it. I don't want to bring them in, expect them to go build the box for me. Like, that's my job. So that was how I thought of it. And so once things were processized enough in the sales side that I could just like run through the deck, ask a few standard questions, and then I knew what the follow-ups would look like. And I knew how, 90% of the common questions, and I wrote all those down, then I could hire a salesperson. He did relatively well. But before that would have been really hard. And so, with the podcast consultant that we bought last year, like I'm still in the sales role, because it's not big enough to hire somebody to pay the 10, 15K a month, like you mentioned, and B, I still haven't learned it well enough. I don't think I'm not quite there on like the level of maturity I want to be where like I can define this thing and put it in a package and be like, here's how to sell the podcast consultant. So that's what I would think about there is like, how do you package it up so it's so easy that anybody could do it or any good salesperson could do it?
You also mentioned that you are very big on time management on multiple instances and you track all of that very diligently. So give us some advice on time management for entrepreneurs. How do you track that?
And speaking of that, I'm going to have to cut off in just a second because I have another meeting I'm going to be late for. I use a tool called Toggle, and I've always compartmentalized my time into different buckets, and then I track it I look at it every week, and then every month or quarter, I'll dive back and be like, okay, what am I spending time on? So for me now, what that looks like is very different. But early on, I divided my time into sales, marketing, operational and admin stuff, and then production of work, like actually writing and editing. And I just would look at every week, how much of my time is going to each of these buckets and what do I want to ideally be? And you kind of redefine that as you go. So like early on, I was like, I want to spend 50% of my time on sales marketing and 50% on basically production and admin. So I just track my time. And if I started to get to a point where I was like creeping up and I'm doing too much production and admin, not enough sales, I know I have to hire somebody in production side. And so that's the template I used starting draft.dev to like decide when to hire people. Now, how to hire those people and like, how to pick the right people, that's a whole nother thing. And I'm still figuring out. Hiring, it's just, man, I wish I had a silver bullet for that one. It's a work in progress.
Yeah, it's tough. But we're almost done anyways. There's like a very last thing. Do you remember this picture that you posted on Twitter of 11 years ago? This was my office, my bed, and my entertainment room.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Is that a fucking joke? Like, was that really your, like, look at this thing. You can't have been sleeping there, man.
Dude, you were talking about wanting to live with nothing. That was my mission. I finished college and I was like, man, okay, so here's a very quick story. I finished college. I had graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering. I didn't want to use it. I wanted to go work at a startup. And I was like, I wanted to be an entrepreneur someday. I didn't know what to start at the time. Anyway, so I was like, I want to learn to live with nothing. And I sold everything I owned, like literally everything except for that little bunch of crap you see there, and then clothes maybe. And that was it. And I camped and lived on couches for 6 months or so before I settled in Chicago and I was freelancing / then started full-time with a startup that was based here. And it was really baseline. I read the 4-hour work week around that same time. And one of the things in there that he kind of points out is you can live anywhere you want, but you got to be willing to kind of like adjust your lifestyle to what is realistic for the cost of living. And like, if you can live with nothing, you can live anywhere. It's just kind of like this funny thing that people don't think about. So I had a job, I was making money. I could have bought, like, had a normal life, but I was just ready to like start kind of fresh and just be like, let's tear it all down from the ground up. So when my wife met me, I was still sleeping on a sleeping bag in a 1-room apartment, like on the floor. She thought I was fucking insane. And she stayed there twice before she's like, all right, we're never doing that again. But and so I have much more stuff now. I'm a more normal person now, but like it was a good period of my life to do that and just kind of baseline at a new level.
It's a good way to find a wife that truly cares about you and not about your money.
That's a very true point. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, man. I think this was really, really enlightening. I think it was really fun. Thanks for coming on, Karl. Would you have any like websites, any Twitter profiles where you would, like people to connect with you?
Yeah, I'm at Karl L. Hughes on Twitter and LinkedIn. Karl's with a K. Karl at draft.dev if you want to email me. I'm always happy to chat with other entrepreneurs or share blog posts I've written. I write a ton about my journey and what I've learned along the way. And there's still so much more to learn. I'm just excited to keep facing that every day. So looking forward to seeing this episode out and then hearing from people if they have any questions I can help with.